Imagine this. You're sitting peacefully in your small wooden house somewhere in Eastern Europe in the 13th century. Maybe you've just baked bread, or you're tending to your goats, when suddenly, thunder. Not from the sky, but from the earth itself. The ground begins to tremble, the sound of thousands of hooves rolling like a storm. Before you can even process what's happening, riders appear on the horizon. Fast, organized, terrifying. Their horses kick up dust, their arrows are already drawn, and within minutes, the entire world you knew is on fire. Congratulations, you've just met the Mongols. And no, you wouldn't last 5 minutes. Because here's the thing, Mongol raids weren't like ordinary battles. They weren't just about a few men charging in with swords and yelling bravado. They were calculated, precise, and shockingly effective. If the medieval world had superheroes, or maybe supervillains, depending on your point of view, the Mongols were it. To survive one of their raids, you would have needed speed, strategy, and probably a lot of luck. And even then, let's be honest, you were most likely doomed. Hey traveler, tonight we're stepping into one of the most dramatic chapters in world history, the age of the Mongol Empire. We're going to talk about how these people lived, why they were so unstoppable, and what made their raids feel almost supernatural to those who faced them. Get comfortable, tuck yourself into your warm bed, and thank the universe that you weren't living on the front lines of a Mongol invasion. Trust me, your cozy blankets are far better than a yurt on the steppe when arrows are flying. Here's how tonight's journey will unfold. First, we'll look at the people and culture of the Mongols themselves, who they were, what they believed, and how their daily life shaped them into such fierce fighters. Then we'll explore the geography and nature of their homeland, the vast Eurasian steppe, because the land they came from was like a training ground for warriors. After that, we'll ride through their early history, how small tribes of nomads united under one extraordinary leader, Genghis Khan, and reshaped the world. From there, we'll move into their later history, as their empire expanded into the largest the world has ever seen, spanning from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. Finally, we'll bring things into the present, because believe it or not, the legacy of the Mongols is still alive in today's Mongolia and beyond. But before we move into all of that, let's sit with the feeling for just a moment. The dread of hearing hooves in the distance, knowing you have no chance. Medieval chroniclers wrote about villages wiped out in hours, cities reduced to ash, entire kingdoms trembling at the thought of Mongol armies. Survivors described them as if they were forces of nature, faster than storms, deadlier than plagues. And in a way, they kind of were. Because the Mongols weren't just warriors, they were experts in psychology. They spread fear deliberately, knowing it could conquer cities before an arrow was even fired. Tales of their brutality traveled faster than they did, so when they arrived at a new city, sometimes people surrendered immediately just to avoid destruction. Others resisted and regretted it. Now let's pause and remind ourselves, these weren't faceless monsters. They were people, families, herdsmen, nomads who lived in felt tents on endless grasslands, who worshipped the eternal sky, who survived in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Their lives trained them from birth to ride horses, shoot arrows, endure hunger, and withstand freezing winters. In short, their culture itself was like a boot camp that produced some of the toughest humans the world has ever known. When you think of it that way, maybe it's not surprising that 5 minutes in their path was 5 minutes too many. And here's where our story tonight gets fascinating. Because surviving a Mongol raid wasn't just about skill, it was about understanding the people behind it. And that's where we're headed next. We'll slow things down and step into the daily lives of the Mongols. What they ate, how they raised their children, what they believed about life and death. We'll talk about how community, tradition, and survival in the unforgiving steppe molded them into warriors without equal. And of course, we'll sprinkle in the humor and honesty along the way, because even superheroes or supervillains had their quirks. So pull your blankets a little tighter, relax, and let's wander into the world of the Mongols together. If you'd like to picture yourself as a villager trying to survive 5 minutes in their path, go ahead, but don't say I didn't warn you. If you really want to understand why the Mongols were so terrifying in battle, you first have to understand them as people. Because the story of the Mongols isn't just about wars and conquests. It's about a culture so deeply tied to survival that by the time they exploded onto the world stage, they were already hardened in ways their enemies could barely imagine. Picture growing up in a world where every day was a test. If you couldn't ride, you couldn't keep up. If you couldn't hunt, you didn't eat. If you couldn't endure the cold winds of the steppe, you simply didn't make it. That's the kind of world that forged the Mongols, and it's the reason you, sitting comfortably in bed, wouldn't last a day in their shoes, let alone 5 minutes in their raid. The Mongols were nomads, meaning they didn't build cities or settle in one place for long. Instead, their entire society was built around mobility. Families lived in portable homes called yurts, round tents made of felt stretched over wooden frames, designed to be taken down and reassembled in just an hour or two. Imagine that. Your whole house packed up on the back of a few oxen or camels, moving with the seasons as you followed your herds across the vast Eurasian grasslands. For a settled farmer in Europe or China, that kind of life might seem chaotic or unstable. But for the Mongols, it was freedom. They weren't tied down by walls or fields. They were tied to the land itself and the rhythm of the animals they raised. Speaking of animals, let's talk about the heart of Mongol life, the horse. To the Mongols, horses were more than just transportation. They were everything. A Mongol child learned to ride almost before they learned to walk. Horses provided milk to drink, hair for rope, even meat when times were desperate. And in battle, the horse was a Mongol warrior's partner. These weren't giant war horses like European knights rode. Mongol horses were small, tough, and incredibly hardy, perfect for surviving long journeys across harsh landscapes. The Mongols bred them for endurance, not speed, which meant they could ride all day and still have the strength to fight when they arrived. And here's the kicker. Each warrior didn't ride just one horse. They brought several, switching mounts throughout the day, so none of them got exhausted. That's how Mongol armies could move faster than anyone else in the medieval world. Now imagine growing up in that culture. As a child, you weren't playing with toys in a backyard. You were out on the steppe, learning to shoot a bow from horseback while the wind whipped your face. You were taught to endure hunger when food was scarce, and to drink fermented mare's milk when water wasn't available. To outsiders, it might sound harsh. To the Mongols, it was normal. And this is what gave them an almost superhuman edge in war. Their lifestyle was already a kind of training camp. They didn't need boot camps or drills. Every single day of their lives was a lesson in survival. Religion, too, shaped their worldview. The Mongols worshipped the eternal blue sky, Tengri, and they saw themselves as chosen to rule under its vast dome. This wasn't an organized religion like Christianity or Islam, but a spiritual belief system rooted in nature, ancestors, and the spirits around them. Shamans played an important role, acting as mediators between the human world and the spirit world, guiding people through rituals and sacrifices. What's fascinating is that while the Mongols held on to their sky worship, they were also famously tolerant of other religions. As their empire expanded, they welcomed Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and others into their fold. It wasn't unusual to see multiple faiths coexisting under Mongol rule, a rare thing in a time when many wars were fought over religion. But don't be fooled into thinking this made the Mongols gentle. Their tolerance came from practicality, not softness. If a religion helped keep the peace or made people easier to govern, the Mongols were all for it. But if anyone resisted their authority, tolerance disappeared quickly. They could be brutally pragmatic, burning a city to the ground one day, then rebuilding it as a trade hub the next. Food tells us another part of their story. The Mongol diet was simple, built on what their herds could provide. Meat, milk, yogurt, and cheese made up the bulk of it, with fermented mare's milk, called kumis, being a favorite drink. It had a sour, alcoholic tang, and to outsiders it probably tasted like spoiled milk gone wrong. But to the Mongols, it was fuel. Hunting and gathering filled in the gaps. Wild onions, berries, fish when available. To a sedentary farmer used to bread and vegetables, the Mongol diet would have seemed strange, maybe even gross. But it was high in protein and fat, perfect for long rides and cold winters. Family and social structure also reflected their harsh environment. Families were tightly knit, and everyone had a role. Women weren't hidden away like in many medieval societies. They were central to Mongol life. While men rode off to war, women managed households, traded, herded animals, and sometimes even fought. In fact, some Mongol women became powerful leaders, advising or even ruling after their husbands died. Compared to Europe at the time, Mongol women had far more influence and independence. At the larger scale, Mongol society was organized into tribes and clans, each led by a khan or chief. Loyalty was everything. If you betrayed your leader, you might be abandoned, or worse. But loyalty also came with rewards. A strong Khan could unite multiple tribes into a powerful force, as Genghis Khan famously did. What's remarkable is how meritocratic their system could be. Unlike in Europe, where nobility was inherited, the Mongols often promoted people based on ability. If you were a brilliant warrior or strategist, you could rise in rank, even if you were born poor. That sense of opportunity made their armies both disciplined and motivated. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. Life as a Mongol wasn't all noble horsemanship and spiritual wisdom. It was tough, brutal even. Winters on the steppe could kill livestock by the thousands, leaving families starving. Raids weren't just something they inflicted on others. They also endured them from rival tribes before Genghis Khan united them. Violence was a fact of life, and survival sometimes meant taking from others. To outsiders, the Mongols seemed cruel and barbaric, but to themselves, they were simply doing what was necessary to endure in a harsh world. And here's where the superhero training camp idea really clicks. From the outside, the Mongols looked like an unstoppable army that appeared out of nowhere. But when you break it down, their entire culture functioned as preparation for that role. The way they lived, constantly moving, constantly adapting, gave them unmatched endurance. Their horsemanship made them mobile in ways no settled army could match. Their diet kept them strong on long campaigns. Their social structure rewarded talent, ensuring the best rose to the top. Even their spirituality reinforced their sense of destiny. Every aspect of their lives honed them into people who could not only survive, but dominate in environments that would crush most others. So if you ask yourself, could you survive 5 minutes in a Mongol raid? The honest answer is no, because you weren't raised in that world. You weren't taught from birth to ride, to fight, to endure hunger and cold without complaint. To the Mongols, that was everyday life. To you, it would feel like being dropped into a nightmare. And that's just their culture. We haven't even gotten into the land that shaped them, the endless grasslands, the freezing winters, the scorching summers, that natural crucible that produced warriors tougher than steel. That's where we're headed next. Because to understand the Mongols, you have to understand the steppe itself. When we talk about the Mongols, we have to talk about the land that shaped them. Because the truth is, without the steppe, there would be no Mongols. That vast stretch of grassland across Eurasia is more than just a backdrop. It's the crucible that forged their resilience, their mobility, and their hunger for expansion. And honestly, if you were dropped there even for a day, you'd quickly realize why survival in a Mongol raid wasn't just about avoiding arrows. It was about surviving the land that produced the people firing those arrows in the first place. The Eurasian steppe is enormous, stretching from Hungary in the west all the way to Manchuria in the east. To give you an idea, it's like an ocean of grass, thousands of miles wide, with very few trees to break up the horizon. It's not the kind of landscape you can hide in. There are no forests for cover, no mountains shielding you, just endless rolling plains that seem to go on forever. That openness defined Mongol life. It made horseback travel not only possible, but essential. On the steppe, walking on foot would be a death sentence. Distances are just too great and conditions too harsh. Horses weren't optional, they were lifelines. And the weather? Let's just say the steppe is not a forgiving place. Summers can be brutally hot, with temperatures soaring past 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees, while winters are the kind that make you question why you ever thought Earth was habitable in the first place. We're talking bone-freezing cold, with icy winds that cut straight through you. In some parts of Mongolia today, it can drop to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 40 degrees Celsius in winter. At those temperatures, boiling water thrown into the air will freeze before it hits the ground. Try lasting a night outside in that, with no central heating, no warm bed, just a yurt and a couple of animal hides. The Mongols didn't just last, they thrived. Those extreme seasons shaped the way they lived. In the summer, they moved with their herds to find grazing pastures, traveling dozens of miles to ensure their animals had food. In winter, they sought sheltered valleys where the wind wasn't as cruel. That constant cycle of movement meant they never built permanent cities or relied on farming like their neighbors. The land didn't allow it. Instead, they turned to herding animals: horses, sheep, goats, cattle, yaks, and camels. These animals weren't just food sources, they were clothing, shelter, and wealth rolled into one. Your herd wasn't just your livelihood, it was your survival kit. Lose it, and you didn't last long. Nature on the steppe might seem barren, but it's alive in ways you might not expect. Herds of wild horses, called taki, or Przewalski's horses, still roam parts of Mongolia today. They're stockier and tougher than the horses you're used to seeing. Wolves prowl the plains, hunting those herds or picking off livestock, while golden eagles soar overhead, sometimes even trained by humans to hunt foxes and rabbits. The steppe might look empty at first glance, but it pulses with life. Life that's just as tough and resourceful as the people who live there. But living in this environment wasn't without danger. Natural disasters on the steppe could wipe out entire families in one blow. There's even a word for it in Mongolian, dzud. It describes a particularly brutal winter where snow and ice cover the ground so thickly that animals can't reach the grass beneath. When that happens, herds starve, and in turn, so do the people. Even today, dzuds kill millions of livestock every decade in Mongolia. Imagine watching your entire wealth, food source, and means of transport collapse in a single season. It's no wonder the Mongols developed a culture of raiding and expansion. Sometimes, taking what you needed from your neighbors was the only way to guarantee survival. Geography also dictated how the Mongols interacted with the rest of the world. To the south lay China, a land of cities, walls, and farmland. To the west stretched the vastness of Central Asia, with its oases and trade routes like the Silk Road. And beyond that, the kingdoms of Persia and eventually Europe. The Mongols didn't just emerge out of nowhere. Their homeland was perfectly positioned to act as a launching pad into all of these regions. Once Genghis Khan united the tribes, the steppe became less of a cage and more of a springboard, allowing them to strike out in any direction they wanted. But let's not forget the sheer psychological effect of the steppe itself. Imagine standing on an open plain with nothing but grass and sky in every direction. There's a strange beauty to it, sure, but also a loneliness. You feel small, exposed, vulnerable. Now imagine living in that every single day of your life. It makes you hard. It makes you resourceful. It makes you always aware that the world doesn't care about your comfort. That's the mindset the steppe created, and it carried over into how the Mongols fought. When you've grown up with that kind of exposure, sneaking up on an enemy through open plains, surviving on scraps, or enduring days without water, all of that feels normal. Another factor that made the geography of the steppe so influential was its role in shaping warfare. Unlike the forests or mountains of Europe, the steppe was perfect for cavalry. Horses could run at full speed for miles, unhindered by obstacles. That meant battles weren't fought like the ones you might picture in medieval Europe, with knights in armor clashing on foot. Instead, Mongol warfare was a deadly dance of mobility. They could strike fast, retreat, and circle around, all because the land itself encouraged that kind of fighting. If the Mongols had been born in dense forests, their style of war might have been completely different. But on the steppe, horses and archery ruled supreme. And speaking of archery, the natural environment even shaped their weapons. Mongol bows were short and recurved, made of layers of wood, horn, and sinew glued together. This design wasn't just random. It was perfect for shooting from horseback. Long European bows were powerful but unwieldy. Try pulling one of those while galloping across uneven ground. The Mongol bow, on the other hand, could deliver deadly force even while you were bouncing on the back of a horse at full speed. And guess what? The materials for those bows, horn, sinew, glue, came directly from the animals they herded on the steppe. Their weapons were literally born from their land. Now let's shift from the wide open plains to the borders where geography played a different role. South of Mongolia lay the Gobi Desert, a place so harsh it made the steppe look cozy. The Gobi isn't all sand dunes like you might picture. It's mostly gravel plains, rocky outcrops, and scorching temperatures by day that plummet at night. Crossing it wasn't easy, but the Mongols knew its paths, its scarce waterholes, its seasonal rhythms. To enemies unfamiliar with it, the Gobi was a deadly barrier. To the Mongols, it was just another part of their backyard. Beyond the desert lay the mountains of northern China, and then the Great Wall itself. The wall wasn't a single unbroken barrier at this time, but a series of fortifications built and rebuilt by Chinese dynasties to keep steppe raiders out. Geography had created a clash point, the open plains meeting the settled farmlands, nomads meeting city dwellers. And that clash shaped centuries of conflict long before Genghis Khan ever arrived. The Mongols weren't the first to raid across that line, but they were the ones who pushed it further than anyone thought possible. What's interesting, too, is how the steppe connected worlds. It wasn't just a Mongol playground, it was a highway. Long before and long after the Mongols, caravans traveled across it, linking China with Persia, India, and Europe. When the Mongols eventually built their empire, they didn't just conquer land, they unified that vast stretch, making it safer for trade than it had ever been. Geography made them conquerors, but it also made them bridges. So if you're lying there in bed, cozy under your blanket, imagining what it'd be like to step into a Mongol raid, remember this. The raid wasn't just the clash of armies. It was the product of a landscape that demanded toughness, adaptability, and ruthlessness. A land where winters could kill you, summers could scorch you, and distance itself was an enemy. Surviving a Mongol raid meant facing warriors shaped by that land. Warriors for whom hunger, thirst, and cold were daily realities, not extraordinary hardships. And here's the final thought about geography. It never really leaves the people it shapes. Even after the Mongol Empire fractured and shrank, the steppe still produced tough, resilient nomads. The land doesn't change easily, and neither do the people who grow up on it. That's why even centuries after their empire fell, the Mongols are remembered as almost superhuman raiders. Because the land that made them doesn't care if you're weak, it spits you out. And next, to see how these steppe-hardened nomads turned into the most feared warriors of the medieval world, we'll ride straight into their history. The rise of Genghis Khan, the battles that shook continents, and the empires that crumbled before the hooves of Mongol horses. Long before the thunder of Mongol hooves shook the earth, the steppe was home to countless tribes who lived in fragile alliances and brutal rivalries. These were people hardened by the land, herding their flocks across windswept plains, clashing over pasture rights, and raiding neighbors when survival demanded it. The Mongols weren't born as a single united force. They were scattered, fragmented, and often too busy fighting each other to dream of conquering the world. For centuries, the steppe produced waves of nomadic groups who threatened the civilizations at its edges. The Huns, the Turks, and others, but none quite matched what the Mongols were about to become. By the late 12th century, Mongol society was caught in a cycle of blood feuds and shifting alliances. Tribal leaders, called Khans, constantly vied for power, and loyalty often lasted only as long as you had food to share or victories to promise. Into this turbulent world, around 1162, a boy was born near the Onon River. His name was Temujin. You may know him by the title he would later claim, Genghis Khan. But when he came into the world, he was just another child of the steppe, the son of a minor chieftain whose fortunes would soon collapse. When Temujin was 9 years old, his father was poisoned by a rival clan. Suddenly, the boy and his family were abandoned, left to starve on the steppe. Imagine being a child, watching your tribe scatter. Your mother struggled to feed you on scraps of roots and fish caught from frozen rivers. This was the beginning of Genghis Khan's story. Not with armies or banners, but with hardship so intense it might have broken most people. For Temujin, it hardened him. His childhood was marked by betrayal, violence, and survival against impossible odds. At one point, he was even captured by a rival tribe, enslaved, and made to wear a wooden collar around his neck. He escaped. He always escaped. Over time, Temujin began to gather followers. He proved himself not only in battle, but in vision. Unlike many steppe leaders who relied only on family ties and tribal loyalty, Temujin promoted people based on merit. If you were skilled, loyal, and brave, he raised you up, even if you were from a defeated enemy clan. Slowly but surely, he built a network that valued ability over bloodline, and it gave him an edge. While other chieftains fought and schemed in circles, Temujin was playing a longer game. By 1206, after years of battles, betrayals, and careful diplomacy, Temujin had done the impossible. He united the Mongol tribes under his rule. At a great council known as a Kurultai, he was given the title Genghis Khan, universal ruler. For the first time, the Mongols stood as one people, and the world had no idea what was about to hit it. The first campaigns under Genghis Khan tested this new unity. His armies struck north and west, crushing rival steppe tribes and securing loyalty through both fear and reward. Then came the Jin dynasty in northern China, a wealthy, powerful state that had long looked down on the nomads as backward barbarians. Genghis Khan saw an opportunity. In 1211, the Mongols swept into Jin territory. They didn't just rely on brute force, they used brilliant tactics. Feigned retreats, encirclements, psychological warfare. At one siege, Mongols catapulted flaming tar-soaked bombs over city walls. At another, they reportedly tied burning bundles to horses' tails, sending them charging toward enemy lines in a stampede of fire and panic. Within a few years, the Jin were forced to abandon their capital, and Genghis Khan's reputation as a conqueror began to spread. But he wasn't content with one victory. He turned west toward the rich lands of Central Asia. There, in the Khwarezm Empire, he found both opportunity and betrayal. At first, he sought trade. He sent merchants and envoys. But the Khwarezm ruler, suspicious or arrogant, had them killed. Genghis Khan's response was swift and merciless. His armies unleashed devastation across Central Asia in the 1210s, burning cities, massacring populations, and sending survivors fleeing in terror. Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgent, names that once meant wealth and splendor, were reduced to rubble. For the people caught in these invasions, it must have felt like the world was ending. The Mongols weren't just destructive, though. They were shockingly adaptable. They learned siegecraft from Chinese engineers, incorporating catapults, siege towers, and even early forms of gunpowder weapons into their campaigns. They created an intelligence network, using scouts and spies to map out enemy weaknesses long before they struck. They even practiced biological warfare, hurling plague-infected bodies over city walls to sow panic and disease. In every way, they were rewriting the rules of medieval warfare. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Yellow River in China to the Caspian Sea. But this was only the beginning. His successors, sons and grandsons, took up the mantle and expanded it even further. Under Ogedei Khan, the Mongols pushed deep into Eastern Europe. They destroyed the armies of Poland and Hungary in the 1240s, leaving entire regions in ashes. In 1241, they reached the gates of Vienna. Imagine that. Horsemen from the Mongolian steppe riding into the heart of Europe, unstoppable, almost supernatural in their reach. Only the sudden death of Ogedei pulled them back, sparing Europe from what might have been total conquest. Meanwhile, in the east, other Mongol forces were tearing through the Song dynasty in southern China. Kublai Khan, a grandson of Genghis, would eventually complete this conquest, establishing the Yuan dynasty in 1271. For the first time in history, all of China was ruled by foreigners. Kublai didn't just conquer, he built. He moved the capital to what is now Beijing, fostered trade along the Silk Road, and welcomed travelers like Marco Polo, whose tales of Mongol wealth and grandeur would dazzle Europe for generations. Yet, the Mongols were not invincible. Nature and overreach began to check their power. Twice they attempted to invade Japan, in 1274 and 1281, sending massive fleets across the sea. Both times, typhoons, later called the kamikaze, or divine winds, smashed their ships and saved Japan. In the Middle East, Mongol armies clashed with the Mamluks of Egypt. In 1260, at the Battle of Ain Jalut, the Mamluks dealt the Mongols their first major defeat, proving that the empire could be stopped. Still, the sheer scale of the Mongol Empire remains staggering. At its height, it stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe, from Siberia to India, covering more land than any other empire in history. And yet, it was ruled by people who, just a few generations before, were living in felt tents, milking mares, and chasing herds across the steppe. Their rise was as improbable as it was devastating. Of course, living under Mongol rule was complicated. Yes, they could be ruthless. Cities that resisted were often annihilated. But if you submitted, they could be surprisingly tolerant. The Mongols didn't impose their religion on conquered peoples. They allowed Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and others to practice freely. They valued trade and communication, creating the Yam system, a vast relay network of horses and riders that allowed messages to cross thousands of miles in days. This system connected east and west in ways the world had never seen before. Spices, silk, ideas, and yes, even the Black Death traveled along these routes. And that brings us to another dark chapter tied to the Mongols, the spread of the plague. In the 14th century, during Mongol sieges in Crimea, infected corpses were reportedly catapulted into cities. From there, the plague spread into Europe, triggering the Black Death, which killed tens of millions. While the disease was not caused by the Mongols, their vast empire and trade networks allowed it to spread farther and faster than ever before. The very empire that connected the world also helped spread its deadliest pandemic. By the late 13th and 14th centuries, the Mongol Empire began to fracture. Internal disputes, rebellions, and the sheer difficulty of governing such vast territory caused it to splinter into separate khanates. The Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. Each carried the Mongol legacy in different ways, some lasting centuries, others collapsing quickly. But the unified thunder of Mongol conquest had passed. Still, the image of the Mongols endured. For those who lived through their invasions, they seemed less like men and more like a force of nature, unstoppable, merciless, and swift as the wind across the plains. And even today, their empire remains a reminder of how quickly history can change. In just a few decades, a people once dismissed as wandering herders became the masters of half the known world. So, could you survive 5 minutes in a Mongol raid? After hearing their history, the answer seems pretty clear. Against warriors forged by the steppe, led by one of the greatest military minds in history, and backed by an empire that reshaped continents, you'd be lucky to last even that long. By the 14th century, the mighty Mongol Empire was beginning to unravel. What had once been a single force that stretched across Eurasia fractured into separate khanates, each ruled by different branches of Genghis Khan's descendants. For a while, these khanates held their ground, powerful, wealthy, and still feared, but the days of unstoppable Mongol raids were fading. The world had changed, and the Mongols would have to change with it, though not always willingly. In Persia, the Ilkhanate splintered and eventually collapsed under internal disputes and external pressures. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate lingered, but gradually lost influence as Turkic groups and new powers rose. The Golden Horde in Russia was one of the longest-lasting branches, ruling over vast swaths of Eastern Europe and exacting tribute from Russian princes. But over time, the Russians grew stronger and more defiant. By the late 15th century, under Ivan III of Moscow, often called Ivan the Great, the Russians threw off Mongol dominance, marking the beginning of Muscovy's rise. The Mongols who once terrorized Europe had been pushed back, absorbed, or defeated. In China, the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan had seemed like the crown jewel of Mongol conquest. But ruling China was not the same as raiding it. The Mongols faced resistance, rebellions, and difficulties integrating with the massive, deeply rooted Chinese culture. By 1368, the Yuan dynasty fell to the Ming, and the Mongols were driven back to the steppe. To many Chinese, this was poetic justice. The barbarians who had once conquered them had been expelled, their dynasty remembered as foreign usurpers. For the Mongols, it was a humbling reminder that conquest and governance are not the same thing. But the Mongol spirit didn't vanish. Even after their empire fractured, the steppe remained home to fierce nomadic clans who carried the memory of Genghis Khan as both a hero and a unifier. Among them, new leaders rose from time to time, trying to rekindle that legacy. One of the most famous was Timur, better known in the West as Tamerlane. Though not a direct descendant of Genghis, Timur claimed the Mongol heritage and used it to justify his own campaigns of conquest across Central Asia, Persia, and India in the 14th and 15th centuries. His empire was brutal and short-lived, but it proved that the Mongol legacy still carried immense weight centuries later. Meanwhile, in Mongolia itself, life returned to something more familiar: nomadic herding, clan rivalries, and the vast, wind-swept plains that had always defined them. But the region didn't remain isolated. In the 16th and 17th centuries, new pressures arrived, from both Russia to the north and China to the south. The Qing dynasty, ruled by the Manchu, eventually absorbed Mongolia into its empire in the 1600s. For the next 2 centuries, much of Mongolia was effectively under Chinese rule, with Mongol princes serving as vassals to the Qing court. This period was complex. On the one hand, Mongolian culture and religion, especially Tibetan Buddhism, flourished under Qing influence. Monasteries sprang up across the land, and Buddhism became central to Mongol identity. On the other hand, Mongol political independence was curtailed. The descendants of Genghis Khan, who once commanded armies that shook the world, were reduced to playing secondary roles in someone else's empire. By the 19th century, The global balance of power was shifting again. Russia was expanding aggressively into Central Asia and Siberia, pressing into territories that had once been firmly nomadic. The Qing dynasty, meanwhile, was weakening, beset by internal rebellions and foreign incursions. Mongolia found itself caught between two great powers, both of whom saw its vast steppe lands as strategically important. Then came the early 20th century, a turning point. In 1911, the Qing dynasty collapsed after centuries of rule. Across its former territories, regions declared independence, and Mongolia was no exception. Led by Bogd Khan, a spiritual and political leader, Outer Mongolia declared itself independent. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Mongols might reclaim sovereignty. But history, as always, had other plans. China, newly transformed into the Republic, claimed Mongolia as its own. At the same time, Russia, now under Tsarist influence and later shaken by revolution, also saw Mongolia as part of its sphere. The result was a tug of war that would define Mongolia's modern history. In the 1920s, after years of instability, the Soviet Union asserted dominance. With Red Army support, communists in Mongolia gained power, and in 1924, the Mongolian People's Republic was officially declared, the second socialist state in the world after the USSR itself. This was a seismic change. For centuries, Mongolia had been a land of nomads, monasteries, and khans. Now, it was a socialist republic, its destiny tied closely to Moscow. Under communist rule, Mongolia underwent rapid and often brutal transformation. Herding collectives replaced traditional family-based herding. Religion, once central to Mongol identity, was suppressed. Monasteries were destroyed, lamas executed or sent into exile. The memory of Genghis Khan, too, was downplayed, as Soviet ideology discouraged nationalist pride that might compete with socialist unity. The Mongols, who once rode out as warriors under the eternal blue sky, now found themselves part of a rigid system dictated from afar. Yet, the Soviet era also brought modernization. Education spread. Industry, though limited, began to grow. Infrastructure was built, linking Mongolia's remote settlements. For the first time, large numbers of Mongols moved from nomadic life into urban centers. Ulaanbaatar, once a small monastery town, expanded into a capital city shaped by Soviet planning. Still, life under communism was harsh. The political purges of the 1930s left scars that linger to this day. Thousands were executed, accused of being spies or enemies of the state. Traditional culture was stifled. And always, the shadow of Moscow loomed large over Mongolian decisions. The nation may have been independent on paper, but in practice, it was often little more than a satellite of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Mongolia once again stood at a crossroads. Suddenly, the support system it had relied on for decades, economic aid, military backing, political guidance, vanished almost overnight. The transition to democracy and a market economy was chaotic. Inflation soared, industries crumbled, and many Mongolians returned to herding as a way to survive. It was a time of uncertainty, but also of possibility. Since then, Mongolia has carved out a unique place in the modern world. It remains a democracy, one of the few in its region, and has worked to balance its relationships between two giant neighbors, Russia and China. Economically, it has leaned on its vast mineral wealth. Coal, copper, and rare earth metals have become central exports, drawing interest from global powers eager to tap Mongolia's resources. At the same time, Mongolia has embraced its cultural heritage in ways that were once suppressed. Genghis Khan, long downplayed under Soviet influence, has been revived as a national hero. His face appears on currency, his name adorns airports and monuments, and his story is taught with pride. While his legacy is still debated, was he a brutal conqueror, a visionary leader, or both? For Mongolians, he represents resilience and identity in a rapidly changing world. Today, Mongolia remains a land of contrasts. In Ulaanbaatar, skyscrapers rise beside gurs, traditional felt tents, where families still live as they have for centuries. The city bustles with traffic, Wi-Fi, and fast food, while out on the steppe, herders continue to move with the seasons, tending their animals under skies that stretch forever. This balance between past and present is not always easy, but it is uniquely Mongolian. Globally, Mongolia is often overlooked, sandwiched between two superpowers. But it has also found ways to punch above its weight. Its commitment to democracy in a region dominated by authoritarian regimes has drawn international respect. Its peacekeeping contributions to the United Nations, though modest, signal a desire to play a role on the global stage. And its natural resources ensure that it will remain geopolitically significant in the decades to come. Yet, challenges remain. Economic dependence on mining makes Mongolia vulnerable to price swings. Climate change threatens the delicate balance of the steppe, with harsher winters, known as dzud, devastating livestock populations. And the question of identity, how to be modern while staying true to centuries of nomadic tradition, continues to shape the Mongolian experience. Looking back, it's astonishing to think how far the Mongols have come. From the days of Genghis Khan's empire, when their horsemen thundered across continents, to centuries of foreign domination, to the hard years of communism, and finally into a fragile but determined democracy. They've endured it all. The Mongol raids that once terrorized the world are long gone, but the spirit that made them possible is still alive in the resilience of the Mongolian people. So, if you imagine yourself in the middle of a Mongol raid, 5 minutes of chaos, terror, and survival, it's worth remembering what came after. The empire collapsed, but the people endured. They rebuilt, adapted, and found ways to carry their legacy into the present. And in that sense, maybe the true story of the Mongols isn't about conquest at all. It's about survival, the kind that lasts not just 5 minutes, but centuries. Today, Mongolia is not the unstoppable empire it once was, but it carries with it the memory of that past in every aspect of life. Walk through Ulaanbaatar, the capital, and you'll see the contrasts everywhere. Towering glass office buildings reflect the sun, while just a few blocks away, smoke curls from the chimneys of traditional gurs, felt tents that have been home to nomads for centuries. It's as if the modern world and the ancient steppe are stitched together, each one unable to fully exist without the other. Politically, Mongolia has carved out a unique niche in the global landscape. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the country transitioned into a multi-party democracy, a rarity in a region dominated by authoritarian neighbors. Today, Mongolians elect their leaders, debate policies openly, and maintain a free press that is still evolving, sometimes turbulent, but alive. For a nation wedged between Russia and China, this is no small feat. Its independence is often fragile, but it stands as a statement. Mongolia belongs to no one but itself. Economically, the backbone of the country remains tied to two worlds, the old and the new. On the one hand, herding is still essential. Around a third of Mongolians continue the nomadic way of life, moving with their sheep, goats, horses, and camels across the steppe. This is more than just tradition, it's survival. Livestock provides food, clothing, and income, yet it is also vulnerable. Climate change has made the winters harsher and the summers drier, creating disasters known as dzuds, when animals perish by the thousands in storms or from lack of grazing. For nomads, these events are devastating, and many end up moving to Ulaanbaatar in search of new opportunities. On the other hand, mining has become Mongolia's modern lifeline. The country is rich in copper, coal, and rare earth elements, resources that the world craves, especially China, which buys the lion's share. This has brought growth and foreign investment, but also dependence. When mineral prices fall, Mongolia's economy feels the shock immediately. It's the kind of boom and bust cycle that leaves people wondering whether the wealth of the land is a blessing or a curse. Socially, Mongolia faces the tension of balancing tradition with modernity. In the countryside, life is still defined by the rhythms of the land and the seasons, much as it was in the time of Genghis Khan. In the cities, however, especially Ulaanbaatar, young Mongolians embrace technology, global fashion, and K-pop as much as they do traditional throat singing or wrestling festivals. The coexistence of these worlds can feel jarring, but it's also what makes Mongolia so fascinating. And of course, there's the legacy of Genghis Khan. For much of the 20th century, Soviet influence suppressed his image, portraying him as a relic of feudal violence. But today, he has returned with full force as a national symbol. His face is on currency, his name graces the airport, and his colossal statue, 131 feet tall, stands on horseback east of Ulaanbaatar, gleaming in stainless steel, as if to remind everyone who passes that Mongolia once conquered half the known world. To outsiders, this can seem contradictory. How do you celebrate a figure associated with so much bloodshed? But for Mongolians, it's not about glorifying raids. It's about reclaiming an identity that was nearly erased. Genghis Khan represents unity, survival, and pride. On the world stage, Mongolia may not command armies anymore, but it has a voice. The country contributes peacekeepers to UN missions, aligning itself with international cooperation. It balances carefully between its two giant neighbors, Russia and China, while also seeking ties with nations farther away, like the United States, Japan, and European states. This is sometimes called the third neighbor policy, a strategy to ensure Mongolia doesn't become too dependent on either Moscow or Beijing. Yet challenges persist. The wealth gap is growing. While mining has created new millionaires, many herders struggle to get by. Pollution in Ulaanbaatar, especially in winter when coal is burned to heat homes, ranks among the worst in the world. Young people often leave the countryside for the city, putting pressure on urban infrastructure while leaving villages more isolated. Still, despite these hurdles, there's a sense of resilience woven into Mongolian life. It's as if centuries of surviving on the unforgiving steppe and 5 minutes of surviving a Mongol raid have left a permanent imprint. No matter what comes, they adapt. When you look at Mongolia today, it's easy to forget just how influential this land once was. The Mongol raids that terrified Europe, the empire that reshaped Asia, the warriors who could travel 100 miles in a day, all of it feels like another world. And yet, the endurance of the Mongolian people shows that those lives, those battles, those moments of chaos weren't in vain. The empire may be gone, but the culture, spirit, and determination remain. So, could you survive 5 minutes in a Mongol raid? Probably not. The arrows, the fire, the thunder of hooves, it would overwhelm almost anyone. But the more important question is this: could you survive like the Mongols did? Could you adapt to endless winters, shifting powers, foreign domination, and the pull of modern change while still holding on to who you are? That's the real story. The Mongols didn't just survive 5 minutes. They survived centuries. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. A people who once conquered the world, who lost it, and who found a way to endure anyway. Close your eyes, let the chaos of the raid drift away, and instead imagine the soft winds of the steppe, carrying with them the echoes of horse hooves and distant songs. Sleep well, traveler. The world is harsh, but as the Mongols show us, survival is always possible.